Have you ever sat in a room full of people who were smiling right at you, glasses clinking, plates being passed, laughter bouncing off the walls, everyone acting like this was just another warm family moment, while underneath all that noise they were quietly celebrating your downfall, already convinced you were finished, already dividing up what they believed would soon be theirs, already counting your money before you were even gone? And did you ever stop to wonder what would happen if, just once in your life, the person they underestimated didn't explode, didn't beg, didn't defend himself, didn't storm out, but instead stayed quiet long enough for the truth to walk into the room all by itself and take a seat at the table? I'm a 56-year-old man, born and raised believing that family meant loyalty and that respect was something you earned by showing up, and I'm telling this story in my own voice because I was there the night my own mother decided my value had expired like spoiled milk. I was sitting just a few feet away when she smiled and announced my removal like it was a favor to everyone else, and I was there when she learned, far too late, that she had misjudged the one son who never needed her approval, never needed her praise, and never needed her permission to quietly control the future while everyone else was busy underestimating him. That night didn't start with anger, it started with familiarity, the kind that lulls you into thinking things might finally be different, the kind that whispers maybe this time she'll see you, maybe this time she'll say thank you, maybe this time your years of showing up will matter. And as I sat there listening to the sound of forks scraping plates and relatives talking over one another, I could feel that old feeling in my chest, that slow tightening that told me I was once again about to be reminded of where I stood in her world, a world where my younger brother shined without effort and I existed only when something needed fixing or paying for or quietly handled behind the scenes. I had spent decades playing that role without applause, covering bills that went unpaid, handling repairs no one wanted to deal with, stepping in when my mother needed help but never when she handed out praise. And over time I learned something most people don't learn until it's too late, that being reliable makes you invisible, that being calm makes people assume you're weak, and that silence gets mistaken for submission by people who mistake noise for power. As I looked around the table that night, I noticed the way my brother leaned back with a confidence that wasn't earned, the way my mother sat tall at the head like a judge ready to pass sentence, the way certain relatives avoided my eyes like they already knew what was coming, and in that moment I realized this gathering had nothing to do with love or unity or family tradition. It was a performance, carefully staged, designed to humiliate me quietly and reward someone else loudly, and I remember thinking to myself how strange it was that they all believed they knew the ending of this story when none of them had bothered to read the chapters one wrote in silence years ago. I had learned early in life that when favoritism becomes obvious, speaking up only makes you look bitter, so instead I watched, I listened, and I planned, not out of hatred, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation, because there comes a point when a man realizes that loyalty without boundaries is just permission to be used, and love without respect slowly erodes your sense of worth. That realization didn't come overnight, it came in pieces, in late-night drives home after being dismissed again, in phone calls that only came when something was needed, in holidays where my presence was expected but my voice wasn't, and over time I stopped waiting to be chosen and started choosing myself, quietly building a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Sitting at that table, hearing my mother's voice sharpen as she prepared to speak, I could feel every one of those years pressing down on me at once, not as anger, but as clarity, the kind that settles in your bones and tells you that whatever happens next, you will survive it because you've already survived worse in silence. I remember wondering if anyone in that room would notice if I stood up and left, if anyone would even ask me why, and that's when it hit me that this wasn't about walking away anymore. It was about standing still and letting the truth do what it does best when given enough time, because the most dangerous thing you can do to people who underestimate you is to let them believe they're winning right up until the moment they realize they never were. I didn't know exactly how the night would end, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever story they thought they were telling about me was incomplete, missing pages, missing signatures, missing facts they never thought to ask about. And as my mother opened her mouth to declare my worth in front of everyone, I felt an unexpected calm wash over me, the kind that comes when you finally understand that control doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room, it belongs to the person who prepared for silence, for patience, and for the long game. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't the night I lost everything, this was the night the truth finally stepped forward and asked a question no one else was ready to answer. By the time my mother called and said she wanted the whole family together for dinner, I already felt that tight pull deep in my gut, the kind that doesn't scream danger but whispers it softly, the kind you learn to recognize after decades of being disappointed by the same people in the same ways, and even then you still go because some small, stubborn part of you keeps hoping that blood means something, that age brings wisdom, that maybe this time will be different. And I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone after she hung up, staring at the wall longer than I should have, replaying the sound of her voice in my head, polite, controlled, almost sweet, which should have been my first warning because my mother was never sweet unless she wanted something or was about to take something away. She mentioned my brother twice in that short call, praising how well he was doing, how proud she was, how everyone would be happy to see him, and when she finally mentioned my name there was a pause, just a fraction of a second, but enough for me to feel it. Like my existence had to be remembered instead of assumed, like I was an obligation rather than a son, and that pause told me more than her words ever could. Still, I went, because hope doesn't die easily, especially not in men like me who were raised to believe that showing up mattered even when it hurt, and as I drove over that evening watching the sun dip low and stretch long shadows across the road, I thought about all the times I had shown up for this family without applause, without thanks, without recognition, just quietly doing what needed to be done because someone had to, because I was raised that way, because I believed responsibility was its own reward even when no one else noticed. I thought about the property taxes I paid when my mother forgot, the repairs I handled when the roof leaked and no one else answered the phone, the medical bills I covered without telling anyone because I didn't want praise, just peace, and I thought about all the times I kept my mouth shut while my brother strutted around like he'd built the world with his bare hands, soaking up admiration for things he barely touched while I stood in the background holding everything together. Pulling into my mother's driveway that night felt heavier than usual, like my body already knew what my mind was still refusing to accept, and the moment I walked through the door I felt it, that familiar sense of being out of place in a room I had helped maintain for years, the sound of laughter hitting me too loud, too forced, conversation stopping just long enough to acknowledge me before continuing without me, and it felt like stepping onto a stage halfway through a play where everyone else already had the script memorized. The table was too full, packed tight with relatives who smiled at me but didn't really see me, plates arranged just so, glasses already filled, and my mother sat at the head like a queen holding court, posture straight, chin lifted, eyes sharp, the kind of presence that made it clear she had already decided who deserved land and who deserved exile long before anyone took their first bite. I noticed how my brother wouldn't look me in the eye, how he laughed a little too loudly at things that weren't funny, how he leaned back in his chair like someone who felt secure, and that alone told me something was coming, because my brother was never relaxed unless he believed he was winning. I noticed my aunt sipping her wine slowly, avoiding certain glances, caught between discomfort and loyalty, the kind of person who knows something is wrong but chooses silence because silence is easier than courage, and I noticed how conversations kept circling around success, legacy, and family pride, all words that sounded nice on the surface but felt hollow when spoken in that room. As I sat there listening to forks scrape plates and glasses clink together, I realized no one was asking me how I was, no one was interested in my life, my work, my health, or my plans, and that absence spoke louder than any insult ever could, because indifference cuts deeper than anger. Every smile felt rehearsed, every laugh felt timed, and the longer I sat there the clearer it became that this dinner had nothing to do with love, connection, or togetherness. It was a setup, a carefully staged moment designed to make an announcement, to shift power, to rewrite history in front of witnesses who would later claim they were just there for a meal. I could feel it settling in my chest, not as rage, but as understanding, the slow realization that I wasn't there to be celebrated or even tolerated, I was there to play a role, to be the contrast that made someone else look better, to be the quiet example of what happens when you don't fit the story someone else wants to tell. And as I looked around that table, at the faces that had known me my entire life yet still saw only what they wanted to see, I understood with painful clarity that this dinner was never about family, never about love, never about unity. It was about spectacle, about control, about reminding me where they believed I belonged, and in that moment, even before a single word was spoken, I knew this night would change everything, whether they were ready for it or not. After dessert, when the last fork stopped clinking against plates and the room settled into that thick, uncomfortable quiet that always comes before something ugly, my mother slowly pushed her chair back and stood up, clearing her throat the way she always did when she wanted attention, when she wanted the room to focus, when she wanted to feel important, and she smiled that same practice smile she used at church right before making a public announcement, the kind of smile that looks warm on the outside but carries sharp edges underneath if you've known it long enough. She said she had news, important news, something that needed to be said with everyone present so there would be no confusion later, and as she spoke I could feel every pair of eyes drifting toward me even before she turned her head, because on some level they all already knew who this was about. Then she looked straight at me, and what struck me most wasn't anger or disappointment or even sadness in her eyes. It was relief, like she had been waiting a long time to finally say this out loud, like she had rehearsed it in her head and was proud of herself for being brave enough to deliver it. She said I was being removed from the will because I didn't deserve it, because I had disappointed her as a son, because I had chosen my own life instead of orbiting hers, instead of staying close enough to be controlled, instead of playing the role she assigned me decades ago, and every word landed heavy, not because I believed them, but because I recognized the intention behind them, the desire to reduce me in front of an audience, to rewrite my worth while witnesses nodded along. She went on, explaining how my brother, the golden child, the one who never paid a bill on time, never showed up when things got hard, never took responsibility unless there was praise attached to it, would be receiving my share instead, and as she said his name her voice softened, her posture straightened, her pride obvious, as if she were crowning a king rather than redistributing something she never fully understood. The room reacted exactly how she wanted it to, with gasps that felt rehearsed, nods that came too quickly, murmurs of approval that made my stomach tighten not out of pain but out of clarity, because I could see how easily people accepted a story when it benefited them or spared them from discomfort. My brother finally smiled then, that smug little grin that always appeared when he thought he had won something without earning it, leaning back in his chair like a man who believed the future had just been handed to him on a silver platter, and someone reached over to pat his back while another relative avoided my eyes completely, suddenly very interested in their napkin or their glass or the pattern on the tablecloth. I remember noticing small details in that moment, how the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, how the room felt smaller, how my heartbeat slowed instead of racing, because something unexpected happened inside me, something my mother never anticipated. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't stand up or throw words back at her or demand explanations, because I had learned a long time ago that anger gives people exactly what they want, and silence, real silence, scares them far more. I simply sat there with my hands folded in front of me, breathing slow, steady, controlled, letting the moment stretch longer than anyone was comfortable with, and I could feel the shift as seconds passed without the reaction they were waiting for. My calm unsettled them, especially my mother, who expected tears or rage or begging, something she could point to as proof that she was right, that she still had power over me. Instead, she saw a man who wasn't breaking, who wasn't shrinking, who wasn't scrambling to defend himself, and she mistook that calm for defeat, mistook my silence for surrender, mistook my stillness for weakness, and that was her biggest mistake, because while she believed she had just stripped me of my future in front of everyone, what she didn't understand was that she had just revealed her hand completely, and once someone shows you exactly who they think you are and exactly how little they value you, they give you something far more valuable than approval, they give you clarity, and as I sat there absorbing the weight of her words, watching the room absorb the performance she had carefully staged, I knew this moment was not the end of my story the way she believed it was. It was the moment the story finally turned, quietly, invisibly, right under her nose, and the longer I stayed silent, the more certain I became that the people celebrating my removal had no idea how unprepared they were for what came next. What none of them knew, and what I never once felt the need to explain or defend, was that years earlier, long before that dinner, long before my mother decided to turn my worth into a public announcement, I had already seen the pattern clearly enough to make a decision that would quietly change everything, because when you grow up watching favoritism play out over decades, when you watch one child get praised for existing while another is only noticed when something breaks or needs paying for, you either let it crush you or you learn from it, and I chose to learn. I remember the exact moment it clicked for me, sitting alone in my truck outside my mother's house years ago after fixing something yet again while my brother was nowhere to be found, realizing that love in that family came with conditions and approval came with performance, and I thought to myself that if fairness was never going to be given, then protection had to be built, not loudly, not dramatically, but carefully, patiently, and legally. That was when I hired my own attorney, not to start a fight, not to threaten anyone, not even to change the family dynamic, but simply to make sure that the years I had poured into holding things together could never be erased by a smile and a speech. I filed an addendum quietly, the kind that doesn't make noise until it absolutely has to, one that documented every contribution I ever made to the family estate, every dollar I covered when others conveniently forgot, every repair, every tax payment, every investment that kept properties from slipping into disrepair, and I did it not out of revenge, but out of self-respect, because I had finally accepted that the people who benefit most from your silence rarely feel obligated to protect you in return. Over time, I invested my money carefully and quietly, placing assets into structures my mother barely understood and never bothered to ask about, because she assumed control simply by being loud and confident, and she never imagined I would move without announcing it, never imagined I would prepare without seeking approval, and that assumption became her blind spot. I didn't brag about what I was doing, didn't threaten to expose anything, didn't even hint at it during family arguments, because I had learned something crucial through years of being underestimated. Preparation works best when no one sees it happening, and silence, when paired with foresight, becomes a shield no one can crack. Sitting there at that dinner table listening to my mother talk about worth like she had invented it, like she alone got to decide who mattered and who didn't, my mind drifted back through years of quiet effort, late nights working while my brother drank and laughed and told stories about himself, weekends spent fixing things that magically became his accomplishments, checks I wrote that kept the house standing while he took credit for stability he never provided, and I remembered thinking to myself back then, mate, one day they'll show you exactly who they are, and when they do, don't be surprised, just be ready. That night, they showed me, openly and proudly, without realizing they were also exposing themselves to something they never planned for, because what they didn't understand was that power doesn't always sit at the head of the table, it doesn't always announce itself, and it certainly doesn't need applause to exist. As I looked down the table and saw the lawyer sitting quietly near the end, barely noticeable, not eating much, not speaking, just observing, I felt a calm settle over me that had nothing to do with satisfaction and everything to do with certainty, because he wasn't there for my mother, no matter how much she believed the evening belonged to her, and he wasn't there for my brother, no matter how confidently he leaned back in his chair. That lawyer was there because years ago I had made sure the truth would have a witness when the time came, someone whose job wasn't emotion or loyalty or family politics, but facts, documents, and signatures that don't care who smiles the most or who tells the loudest story. In that moment, surrounded by people who thought I was powerless, I understood just how dangerous underestimation can be, not for the person being underestimated, but for the ones doing it, because while they were busy believing I had nothing, I had already secured the one thing they never saw coming: control, not taken by force, not demanded, but earned slowly through patience, preparation, and the quiet refusal to let anyone else decide my future without my consent. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with raised voices, slammed hands, or dramatic accusations. It came wrapped in a sound so small and ordinary that most people barely noticed it at first, the lawyer quietly clearing his throat, a simple human noise that somehow cut through the room sharper than any shout ever could, and I remember how strange it felt that something so subtle could shift the weight of an entire evening. My mother was still standing at the head of the table, soaking in what she believed was her victory, shoulders squared, chin lifted, wearing that look of satisfaction she always wore when she thought she had successfully put someone in their place, while my brother leaned back in his chair like a man who had already cashed a check that hadn't cleared yet, one arm draped casually over the backrest, confidence pouring off him as if the future had just been handed to him with a bow on top. The lawyer adjusted his glasses slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not nervous, then opened a slim folder that until that moment had gone completely unnoticed, and in a calm, professional voice that carried no emotion at all, he said there was an addendum that legally required his attention before any celebration or assumptions could continue, and that was when I felt it, the air in the room shifting, thickening, like oxygen had suddenly become harder to breathe. My mother's smile twitched just a little, the smallest crack forming at the corner of her mouth, the kind you only notice if you're looking closely, and I was, because I had spent my entire life studying her expressions, learning how to read the moments when control started slipping even if she refused to acknowledge it. The lawyer didn't raise his voice, didn't look around for approval, he simply explained, slowly and clearly, that years ago I had filed a binding document connected to multiple properties and financial accounts, assets I had personally funded, managed, and protected over a long period of time, assets that many in that room had assumed belonged entirely to the family estate but were, in fact, structured under specific conditions that placed control solely in my hands. As his words settled in, I watched my brother's smile fade in real time, not dramatically, but like a light slowly being turned off, confusion creeping in first, then disbelief, then something closer to panic, while my mother's hands tightened around the back of her chair as if she needed something solid to keep herself upright, her confidence draining away as she realized she was no longer the one directing the conversation. No one spoke. No one laughed. Forks stayed frozen on plates. Glasses remained untouched. The silence that followed wasn't respectful or thoughtful, it was heavy and raw, the kind that settles in when people suddenly realize they don't understand the situation as well as they thought they did. I could see relatives exchanging quick glances, recalculating their positions, mentally replaying earlier reactions they might soon regret, and in that moment it became painfully clear how fragile assumed power really is when it's built on ignorance. The lawyer continued, laying out facts without drama, explaining how contributions had been documented, how responsibilities had been recorded, how ownership and authority were not matters of opinion or emotion but of legal record, and with every sentence the room seemed to shrink a little more, the confidence that had filled it earlier evaporating into uncertainty. My mother tried to speak once, opening her mouth as if to interrupt, but no words came out, because there is nothing louder than truth when it's backed by preparation, and nothing more disarming than realizing the person you thought you controlled had quietly secured independence years ago. I sat there the entire time, still, silent, watching expressions change, watching fear replace smugness, watching power slide across the table without a single raised voice, and I remember thinking how ironic it was that the same people who mistook my calm for weakness were now unsettled by it, because calm in the face of chaos doesn't come from surrender, it comes from knowing exactly where you stand. That quiet that filled the room wasn't respect, it wasn't admiration, it was fear finally waking up, fear of the unknown, fear of miscalculation, fear of realizing that the story they thought they were writing had been edited long ago without their knowledge. And as I looked around the table at faces suddenly stripped of certainty, I understood that this was the moment everything tipped, not because I demanded it, not because I forced it, but because patience, preparation, and silence had done exactly what they were meant to do, revealing that the real power in the room had never been where they assumed it was. I watched my mother slowly sink back into her chair, the proud, upright posture she had carried so perfectly just moments ago deflating like a balloon that had been punctured, her shoulders curling inward and her hands clutching the edge of the table as if to hold herself together while her eyes darted nervously around the room, searching desperately for an ally, a witness, someone, anyone, who could rescue her from the realization that the victory she had so confidently announced was slipping through her fingers like sand, and the longer she looked, the more I could see the panic settle in behind her wide, unblinking eyes, a sharp contrast to the smug confidence that had lit up her face only seconds before. The lawyer continued, calm, deliberate, methodical, his voice never raising, yet every word slicing through the room like a scalpel, explaining that the inheritance she had assumed she was giving away, that she had announced with such certainty and pride, was contingent upon my consent, my signature, my approval, and that without it, the majority of what she had promised, what she had boasted about, simply did not exist in the way she believed. And as he laid out each clause, each stipulation, each legal detail, the invisible scaffolding of her carefully constructed confidence began to crumble in real time. My brother, who had been leaning back smugly, puffing up like a rooster preening for an audience, suddenly lurched forward, his face twisting in confusion and outrage, his voice sharp, demanding explanations, asserting entitlement as if words alone could reclaim what he had never truly earned. But the lawyer, unshaken and unbothered, methodically shut him down, presenting facts, dates, signatures, and legally binding documents that left no room for argument or manipulation, and I could feel the room shift, the tension thickening as years of assumptions, of whispered approvals, of invisible hierarchies, unraveled in front of everyone like a house of cards collapsing under the weight of gravity. Relatives who had nodded earlier, murmuring in agreement with my mother's proclamations, suddenly became fascinated with their phones, pretending to check messages, scrolling aimlessly, anything to avoid meeting my gaze or acknowledging the collapse of the narrative they had so readily accepted, while my aunt, who had been quietly whispering her approval, stared at her plate as if it could somehow swallow her and remove her from the unfolding reality, and my mother's hands trembled slightly, gripping the table harder, a futile attempt to anchor herself to something solid while the ground beneath her seemed to dissolve. She tried to speak, tried to stitch together excuses, explanations, rationalizations, each word coming out tangled, layered in contradictions, and each sentence only revealed more of her miscalculation, her inability to recognize that the real power in the room had quietly shifted, and that the audience she thought she commanded was now witnessing her unraveling with helpless clarity. The room, once filled with laughter, murmurs of agreement, and the warm pretense of familial celebration, was now dense with a silent shock, a disbelief that spread like a wave from one face to the next, leaving the air thick, almost tangible, as everyone tried to reconcile the woman they thought they knew, the confident matriarch in control of the family legacy, with the frightened, grasping figure before them, scrambling without strategy or plan, exposed by her own assumptions. I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in decades, not anger, not vindication, not even the rush of triumph, but a deep, calm relief, a weight lifting from my chest because the truth was finally speaking for me, louder than any argument or confrontation could ever have done, because the preparation I had carried in silence for so many years, the meticulous documentation, the patience, the foresight, and the quiet endurance, were now doing the work I never had to demand. And as I looked across the table, witnessing the stark collapse of confidence, the fading of smug smiles, the faltering of voices that had previously dictated so much of my life, I realized that this moment was not only about justice or recognition, it was about clarity. The moment everyone in that room understood, whether consciously or not, that assumptions, arrogance, and favoritism are fragile when faced with quiet, deliberate preparation, and that the narrative they believed they controlled could be rewritten by patience, by foresight, by the calm courage of someone who had waited long enough for the truth to finally be acknowledged. And as I breathed in that still, heavy air, feeling the weight of years lift slightly from my shoulders, I knew that my mother's collapse, my brother's shock, and the stunned silence of the family were not signs of victory or defeat in the traditional sense, but proof that the structures they relied on, social, emotional, and financial, were now firmly, quietly, unassailably under my control. And in that moment, as they all slowly realized just how unprepared they were, I felt something rare and pure, the relief of finally being seen as I always was, not through the distorted lens of expectation or favoritism, but through the unshakable clarity of truth. And as the seconds stretched into minutes, and the room remained frozen in that new, unspoken understanding, I recognized that this was a turning point, not just for me, but for everyone present, because the illusion of power had been stripped away in real time, and the quiet, steadfast presence I had maintained for decades had, at last, done more than any words could have ever done to reshape the narrative, reorder expectations, and reveal the reality that for years had been quietly waiting to be acknowledged, a truth that once exposed, could never be ignored again. I didn't stand up. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I didn't yell. I didn't lecture anyone about the years of work I had done in silence. I didn't recite lists of unpaid bills I had covered, roofs I had repaired, repairs my brother claimed as his own, medical expenses I had quietly handled, or nights spent watching over the family home while others partied, laughed, and took their liberties for granted, because I had learned long ago that people like my mother and my brother do not respond to anger, they respond to presence, to calm, to control, and to the quiet, unshakable assertion of authority that needs no applause to be real. And so I simply looked around the table at the faces that had so confidently assumed they knew my place, at the smug expression frozen on my brother's face, at the flush of embarrassment creeping into my mother's cheeks, and I spoke in a voice steady, controlled, even, and I told them that I had never asked to be favored, that I had never wanted approval, that I had never sought recognition for the work I did, that my contributions had always been a matter of responsibility and principle rather than reward. And then I said that all I had ever asked for, all I had ever sought from them, was respect, and since that seemed to be too much for them to grant, I had made the decision long ago to protect myself, to build structures, to document, to plan, to act quietly and decisively. And in saying that, I did not shout, I did not accuse, I did not plead, but simply stated the truth, and that truth hung in the air, heavier than any argument, stronger than any insult, and more final than any emotional appeal they could have thrown at me. I watched my brother's smug confidence waver, saw the tiny tremor in his jaw, the flicker in his eyes as he realized that the foundation of his assumed future, the one he had strutted toward like it was already his by birthright, was nothing more than assumptions and lies, that the story he had celebrated was written on sand and now the tide had come in. My mother, sensing her control slipping once more, tried one last time to guilt me, to remind me of sacrifices she had made for me, of motherhood, of family duty, of all the things that were supposed to bind me to her, to make me bend, to make me acknowledge that she had authority not because she deserved it but because she said it was hers. But her words fell flat, bouncing harmlessly off the armor of preparation and calm I had built over decades, because I understood better than anyone that power does not argue, it does not threaten, it does not beg or demand, it waits, it observes, it endures, and then it acts when all conditions align and the consequences are inevitable. The lawyer, who had remained quiet up to that point except for clearing his throat and producing the documents that would forever shift the balance of authority, confirmed to the entire room that control rested with me, that all future decisions regarding the family estate, assets, and inheritance would require my explicit approval, that no one could override my planning, my documentation, or the legal structures I had put in place, and in that moment the room understood, even if some tried to mask it, that the dynamic had shifted, that the scales of power had quietly, permanently, moved to my side, and there was nothing they could do to reclaim the authority they had assumed was theirs. I could see the subtle panic in my mother's eyes, the disbelief in my brother's posture, the uneasy glances exchanged between aunts, uncles, and cousins who suddenly realized that every decision, every expectation, every plan they had made based on old assumptions, had to be reconsidered, recalculated, and renegotiated now that the truth had been revealed, and all I had done to achieve this shift was remain present, remain calm, remain silent until the moment my actions, my preparation, and my foresight spoke louder than any tantrum or speech ever could, because real power, the kind that cannot be taken away by anger or manipulation, does not need to shout, does not need to demand respect, does not need to assert itself through intimidation. It simply exists, quietly, irreversibly, and finally, undeniably. And in that stillness, in that calm assertion of authority, I watched as the room, filled with people who had once believed they controlled the narrative, came to understand that their assumptions were worthless, their confidence misplaced, and that the balance had shifted quietly but completely, permanently, in a way that would never be undone, and I felt an unfamiliar serenity, not from victory or revenge, but from knowing that for once, the truth had spoken for itself, without fanfare, without noise, without theatrics, and it had been heard, fully, by everyone who needed to hear it, and for the first time in decades, I was finally free from the weight of their expectations, their favoritism, and their illusions of control. That was the moment when the panic finally surfaced, not all at once, but in cracks and shifts so obvious you could almost hear something breaking underneath the polite silence, because my brother was the first to move, leaning forward in his chair with a sudden urgency that hadn't been there before, his tone changing so fast it was almost embarrassing, calling me reasonable, saying we were both adults, suggesting we talk privately like this was some small misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with a quiet side conversation, and I could hear the desperation hiding behind his forced calm, the realization that the future he had already pictured for himself was dissolving right in front of him. My mother followed right after, her voice softening in a way that would have worked on me years ago, telling me she never meant to hurt me, that families fight but forgive, that this was all being taken the wrong way, and I watched her reach for familiar emotional tools like a drowning person grabbing at anything within reach, hoping one of them would still work, hoping I would shrink back into the role I had always played, the reasonable one, the understanding one, the one who absorbed discomfort so others didn't have to. Around the table, the same people who had sat quietly while I was cut out just minutes earlier now looked at me differently, their eyes lingering a little longer, their posture shifting, their expressions tight with concern, as if I suddenly held something essential, like oxygen, and they were realizing for the first time how quickly it could run out. I saw fear in their eyes, not the loud kind that comes with shouting or accusations, but the quiet kind that settles deep when people realize their illusion of control has shattered, when they understand that the hierarchy they relied on, the assumptions they built their comfort on, no longer exists the way they thought they did. It wasn't about money in that moment, not really, it was about certainty, about knowing where you stand, about believing the rules of the game are fixed, and when those rules suddenly change without your permission, panic sets in whether you want it to or not. My brother kept talking, trying different angles, reasoning one second, joking the next, even hinting at compromise, and each word made it clearer how unprepared he was for a reality where he didn't automatically win, where charm and confidence couldn't override preparation and facts. My mother, on the other hand, leaned into emotion, reminding me of childhood moments, sacrifices she claimed to have made, all the ways she believed she had earned authority over me, and I listened without interrupting, without reacting, not because her words didn't sting, but because I had finally learned the difference between listening and surrendering. What struck me most was how quickly the room flipped, how fast sympathy moved, how suddenly people wanted peace, fairness, forgiveness, when just moments ago they were comfortable watching me be erased, and that contrast burned a lesson into me that no amount of advice ever could. I didn't enjoy watching their panic, there was no satisfaction in it for me, no thrill, no sense of revenge fulfilled, because what I felt instead was distance, like I was watching a scene unfold through glass. Emotionally removed enough to see it clearly for what it was, a group of people reacting not to injustice, but to consequences. I realized then how often apologies are shaped by risk, how regret grows louder when power shifts, and how quickly people rediscover the value of unity when they no longer control the outcome. My brother's eyes kept flicking to the lawyer, then back to me, as if hoping one of us would blink first, and my mother's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, betraying the calm tone she was trying so hard to maintain, and all of it felt strangely familiar, because for years I had been the one adjusting, the one swallowing discomfort, the one making things easier so others wouldn't have to face their own behavior. That night, for the first time, I didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't rush to smooth things over, didn't rush to make myself smaller so everyone else could feel bigger, and in that stillness I learned something that settled deep and stayed there. People don't change when they're sorry, because sorry costs nothing. It's just words shaped to calm a situation, but people do change when the cost becomes real, when the consequences can't be talked away, when the balance of power no longer favors them by default. As I looked around that table, at faces suddenly careful with their words, at voices measured where they once were confident, at relationships being reconsidered in real time, I understood that this panic wasn't cruelty or karma, it was reality arriving uninvited, and while I didn't celebrate it, I didn't stop it either, because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is step back and let people sit with the outcome of their own choices.
Instead of standing up and storming out of the room, slamming doors, or letting anger dictate the next moments, I chose to do something far more powerful, far more unsettling for everyone present. I simply clarified my position, calmly, deliberately, without raising my voice, without theatrics. Because by that point the room had already absorbed enough drama to understand that chaos wasn't required for consequences to exist. I told them, in steady, controlled tones, that from this moment forward, the assets would be handled fairly and equitably, and that favoritism, the golden child nonsense, the secret handshakes and whispered promises that had governed decisions for decades, was finished, completely finished. No more assumptions. No more arbitrary decisions about who deserved what based on charm, personality, or proximity to my mother's approval. Everything would be transparent, documented, and earned, and while I spoke, I could see the room shifting, the tension building, the disbelief growing in the faces of those who had previously assumed authority or expected easy inheritance, because fairness isn't something they were accustomed to in our family, and suddenly the rules had changed in a way that didn't rely on yelling or punishment, it relied on logic, structure, and unassailable preparation. My brother was the first to react, his face turning red, veins standing out in his forehead, eyes blazing with the kind of outrage that comes when someone realizes that what they counted on as a guarantee is no longer theirs by default, and he exploded, accusing me of betrayal, accusing me of humiliating him in front of the entire family, spitting words like fire because he thought anger might somehow reclaim what he had celebrated losing minutes earlier, and I didn't flinch. I reminded him, quietly but firmly, that he had applauded my removal without hesitation, that he had sat back and enjoyed the spectacle, that he had celebrated a future built on my exclusion, and now, decades of complacency and entitlement had finally met the natural consequence of their assumptions, and if he was angry now, it was only because reality had caught up with him. My mother, who had until that point hidden behind authority and performance, finally broke, and it wasn't the kind of calculated tears she often used to manipulate situations, it was real, raw, undeniable emotion, tears streaming down her face because she suddenly understood, in a way no argument or persuasion could convey, that she no longer decided, that control had moved, quietly, permanently, and that it didn't need her permission, didn't need her smile, didn't need her approval to exist. She realized that the tables had turned, that the family dynamic she had spent decades reinforcing, shaping, and controlling was gone in an instant, and that I had done it without shouting, without threatening, without attacking, but by simply remaining steady, prepared, and patient long enough for the truth, the structure, and the law to speak for me. As I watched her face, and my brother's shifting posture, and the stunned silence of everyone else around the table, I understood that this was far more than a family dispute, it was a lesson in patience, in foresight, in the quiet but unbreakable force of preparation. No one expected me to act this way, no one anticipated calm clarity as the instrument of change, and that surprise, the disarming effect of control without theatrics, sent ripples through the room that no anger, no shouting, no pleading could have achieved. I felt neither triumph nor malice, only a profound sense of relief, because the long years of careful planning, quiet observation, and patient endurance had finally resulted in a reality where fairness, transparency, and accountability ruled, not favoritism, not emotion, and certainly not outdated assumptions about entitlement. And as I looked around the table, taking in my mother's real tears, My brother's shocked disbelief, the relative's sudden awareness that the world they thought they controlled was now operating under a different set of rules. I understood fully the lesson that night was imparting, that power, when wielded patiently and wisely, does not need to punish to command respect, and that the quiet assertion of fairness can leave a room stunned, reshaping relationships, recalibrating expectations, and leaving no one uncertain about who truly holds authority in a way words alone never could. And I realized then that the true surprise wasn't what I had done, but that everyone else had underestimated what patience, preparation, and a refusal to play by their rules could accomplish. And in that calm, undeniable clarity, the family, for the first time, saw me, not as the obedient son or the silent provider, but as the one who had always been in control, quietly, firmly, and without needing anyone's permission to do what was right.
Here's the truth I carry with me, the lesson that has remained long after the dishes were cleared, the chairs pushed back, and the house emptied of relatives whispering in shock and disbelief. Loyalty without boundaries becomes permission to be used, and I had learned that the hard way over decades, giving, supporting, and sacrificing without clear limits until it became invisible labor, expected and assumed, taken for granted by those who were too self-absorbed to notice what kept their world standing. Silence without preparation becomes vulnerability, a quiet acquiescence that invites others to shape your life without your consent, to dictate your worth based on whim, favoritism, or misunderstanding. And I had spent years living in that shadow, careful, dutiful, overlooked, until I realized that preparation, patient, deliberate, and meticulous, is the only true safeguard against being diminished by those who mistake your quiet for weakness. And when foresight meets patience, when deliberate, unseen action combines with calm observation, it creates a strength no one can take away, no one can challenge, and no one can underestimate, because it is rooted not in emotion, not in spectacle, not in anger or public confrontation, but in facts, structures, and readiness, quietly cultivated over years until the moment arrives and the consequences unfold inevitably, irreversibly, and with clarity. I didn't destroy my family that night, nor did I seek to humiliate them, though my mother and brother may have felt that way. What I did was expose the truth they had built upon, the narrative they assumed they controlled, the fragile illusions of power that had guided their expectations for decades, and in doing so, I allowed reality to speak on its own terms, revealing who truly held influence, who had quietly ensured continuity, responsibility, and authority in a way that could not be swayed by favoritism, pride, or emotion. The future of our family estate, the assets, the properties, the responsibilities, were no longer subjects of assumption or arbitrary judgment, and that realization, while it unsettled many that night, was not born from vengeance. It was born from careful, deliberate foresight, from a refusal to confuse love with surrender, from the recognition that being a dutiful son does not require surrendering autonomy, dignity, or control. And as I reflect on that evening, the way the room shifted from smug confidence to stunned silence, the way panic flickered across faces that had once assumed unquestioned authority, the way calm clarity replaced the chaos they expected, I recognized that the lesson extends far beyond family or inheritance, far beyond money or property. It is about understanding the difference between obedience and respect, between giving and being exploited, between patience and passivity, and between love and subjugation, because so many people live their lives thinking that enduring, tolerating, or quietly accepting wrongs ensures belonging or approval, when in truth, belonging is earned through integrity, preparation, and an unshakable commitment to personal boundaries, and approval is a fragile byproduct that should never dictate the limits of your life. That night, I realized that the loudest voice at the table, the one that thought it controlled the narrative simply by being heard, mattered far less than the one who planned, observed, and acted at the right moment with measured precision. And the power that comes from foresight, patience, and calm execution outlives anger, outlives resentment, and outlives money, because it creates a foundation no one can unsettle, no one can manipulate, and no one can claim as their own. The truth of your actions, when grounded in preparation and deliberate, patient strategy, endures far beyond the noise of confrontation, the theatrics of favoritism, and the temporary satisfaction of seeing someone humbled. And that realization, above all else, is what truly matters, because it is the kind of strength that cannot be borrowed, lent, or taken. It exists because you cultivated it, because you waited, because you understood that real control does not scream, does not demand, does not bend to emotion or expectation. It simply is, steady, firm, and undeniable. And so, in the end, the night concluded not with victory or celebration, not with applause or accusations, but with a profound understanding that while others may have thought they dictated my worth, my place, or my future, the only person who ever truly controlled it was me, the one who had prepared, the one who had waited, the one who had stayed calm and refused to confuse love with surrender, the one who learned that patience, foresight, and integrity are worth infinitely more than fleeting approval, empty praise, or even inheritance itself, because those lessons, once learned and lived, outlast the storm, outlast the conflict, outlast the money, and remain with you forever, shaping every decision, every relationship, and every step forward in life. And for that reason, I know now that I was never powerless, I was never undervalued, I was never truly overlooked, because the control I built, quietly and patiently, is permanent, unassailable, and real, and that, above all else, is the inheritance that cannot be taken, the lesson that outlives everything else, and the quiet power that guides my life long after the echoes of that night have faded.